5 days later, there was another big development in history. And that big development in history was the revolution in Russia. And the revolution in Russia, the new government that came in from that revolution, one of the first things that it did is it published the secret treaties that the old Tsar's government had been a party to, including the secret treaty about dividing up the Middle East when the war was over. So in a very short time, in 1 month, in the end of 1917, the Arab people find out two things: that they have been betrayed, doubly betrayed. One, they had raised armies and fought out alongside the British, but now they find out, when this treaty is published, that the French are taking over what is modern-day Lebanon and Syria, and the British are taking over modern-day Palestine, Jordan, and Iraq, and that there's not going to be any independent state for them. Instead, they're going to be pulled into the two biggest empires that existed. And not only that, but in the center of what they were hoping would be their new state after the war, it's being promised to a European settler population, to European settlers to come and take over that area. So we should just think, this is a part of the history, the hidden history, that is, instead the myths about the age-old hatreds have taken the place of this real history that is virtually never discussed in the mass media in the United States. But you can understand, if we put ourselves in the position of the Arab people at the time, how we would have reacted to that, how we would have felt about that. And for the Arab population in this region, the people who had hoped to have a new state, they went ahead and formed a new state. And this is also something that's never known. And in 1919, they met, a year after the end of World War I, and they met in Damascus, Syria. But the people didn't just come from modern-day Syria, they came from Palestine, Jordan, and Lebanon, and that was all considered to be Syria. Palestine was considered to be southern Syria, but part of Syria. And they established a new state with it was a constitutional monarchy. And they said, how can the Zionists go back in history 2,000 years to prove that by their short sojourn in Palestine, they have now a right to claim it and return to it as a Jewish home, thus crushing the nationalism of 1 million Arabs. But what crushed the nationalism was not the Zionists. They weren't strong enough. The British and the French armies moved in 1920. And in Lebanon and Syria, if you go there today, you can visit the martyrs' squares, they're called, in both the capitals of Beirut and Damascus, where the French hung people who resisted the French takeover of those two countries. And in Iraq in 1920, the year Iraq was formed as a country, 10,000 Iraqis were killed fighting against the British. 2,000 British troops were killed, including the British general who was in charge. That's interesting to know, I think, from the point of view of what's going on up till today, that the Iraqi people never accepted foreign occupation. They didn't accept it in 1920. They rebelled against it in 1925, in 1936, in 1941, over and over and over again, until a revolution in 1958 kicked the British out finally. And in 2003, when the Iraq War started, you might recall, or might have heard, that the leaders in the United States who were saying, yeah, the war, this will be a great war, and the people in Iraq will be throwing flowers and chocolate at our soldiers, welcoming them into Baghdad, might have missed some of the history of this region. But if we want to understand, and this, by the way, what I'm telling you, this story, you can get in a taxi cab in Cairo, and the cab driver can tell you the story I just told, or most of the elements of it. Everybody knows this in the Middle East. Nobody knows it here. You know, we supposedly have the greatest free press in the world. I would submit we sort of live in a bubble. Some things cannot be talked about and are considered outside of the realm of what can be discussed. So now with the British support, the settler movement from Europe really began. 15 years later, 30% of the population was made up of settlers, the Zionist settlers who had come from Europe. Many of them, you know, the people themselves viewed this as a way to escape oppression. The people where they were coming to settle viewed it as the taking over of their territory. And I'll give you an example of why. There were some people among the Zionist settlers who argued in favor of coexistence with the Arab population that lived there. But they were defeated. That was also true in the United States. There were people who were advocated that the settlers who were coming from Europe should have coexist with the indigenous people and have a friendly relationship. They were defeated here in this country. And instead, a policy of extermination was really what was put in place. In 1940, after this project had been going on for a number of decades, one of the leaders of the Zionist movement wrote to his fellow Zionist leaders a letter that explained what the Zionists were thinking about doing. And he says this: among ourselves, it must be clear there's no room for both people in this country. And there is no way, besides transferring the Arabs from here to neighboring countries, to transfer them all. In other words, the indigenous population, we're not just coming to live here, we are coming to live here and get rid of the indigenous population. This is the way, how the land without people could come true, if you could get rid of, transfer, expel the indigenous population. World War II is the next big development in the creation of the state of Israel. World War II is, of course, when the Nazi regimes and their allies, because it wasn't just the Nazis in Germany, it was the fascists in Croatia and in Hungary and in Romania, who all carried out the same policy of extermination against the Jewish population. Millions and millions of Jewish people were killed in the concentration camps. 2/3 of the Roma population of Europe was also killed. That's more popularly known as gypsies, but they do not like to be called that. Prefer the term Roma. Were wiped out, and millions of Slavic people were killed, worked to death in work camps, or killed in battle. Excuse me, in battle. And the Soviet Union lost 27 million people in the war. We should think about what that really means. The 27 million. The U.S. casualties in World War II were about 400,000. 27 million in the Soviet Union. So in the aftermath of this, the United States, as I talk about in the book, the United States leadership and the British leadership had refused to do anything to really try to rescue or limit the number of people who were being killed in the concentration camps. But when the war was over, they supported the creation of the State of Israel. And it was for political reasons that they did so. So you can't really see this very well, but I think I can give you an idea. In 1946, and this is after about 40 years of the Zionist project going on, I put three maps. There's three maps here of the British colony of Palestine. In 1946, the Zionists controlled about 6.6% of the land. They owned it. 6.6%. The next year was a vote at the United Nations, Resolution 181, to divide Palestine into what would become Jewish and Arab states. And 55% of Palestine was awarded to what would become the State of Israel. And at the end of 1948, this is 1946, 1947, now at the end of 1948, Israel made up 78% of Palestine. The West Bank was taken over by Jordan, and Gaza was taken over by Egypt, and there was no Palestinian state at all. And the name Palestine began being taken off the maps of the world very quickly, particularly in the West. But not only did Palestine seem to disappear in 1948, but the Palestinians themselves seemed to disappear too, most of them. In 1948, 3/4 of the population, between 750 and 800,000 Palestinians, were forcibly driven out to make way for the State of Israel. And they were driven out by means of terror. There's a book that an Israeli historian published last year. His name is Ilan Pappé. The name of the book is The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. And I talk some in the book about how it was a policy of massacres and terrorism that drove the population out. This is a big issue down till today. If you read about this, you'll see that one of the issues that's under negotiation or being talked about for negotiation all the time is the Palestinians' right of return. In 1 year after the United Nations created the State of Israel, there was another vote at the United Nations in December 1948 called Resolution 194. And that resolution said all the Palestinians who left had a right to return, to be restored to their property, and to be compensated for any damages. And down till today, not one has been allowed back.